Hey guys, Akiba and Jason back for the next episode of SlateAsia. Sorry, it's been a little while, but both of us have been ill. We're in different time zones, but hopefully we should be back on track to bring you the fortnightly news on what's going on in Asia. So I'm super excited. Asia's been in the crypto news a little bit recently with what's going on in Hong Kong, but I think let's start with Cameron Winklevoss's tweet on the 19th, so just a couple of days ago, talking about the fact that he sees the next bull run starting in the east. What are your thoughts there, Jason? Love to get your take.
Yeah, glad to be back. So obviously we're very bullish on Asia being here since 2015. Have always been kind of the bridge for a lot of the Western projects entering the Asian market. I think if you look back on history, right, you're going to see that one of the things that crypto has been struggling has always been around regulation.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas I do think there's a lot more flexibility working in Asia because, obviously one, the population here is massive,
Mm-hmm.
and two, it just has been generally very, very hard to regulate amongst, different areas of Asia because, Asia in general is very, very culturally different across, various countries, even though they're physically very, very close. But, obviously they have the Japanese community, Korean, Chinese, even some will argue that India, right, Singapore, Malaysia, Indonesia. In general, I think each of these regions have their own way of doing business, their own way of scaling businesses, their own way of regulating digital asset. And so it makes it very, but then it also makes it very difficult for like just to come up with one holistic policy or regulatory environment for everyone to kind of like agree on.
Mm-hmm.
So unlikely we're going to see something, where similar to the U.S., where SEC will come up with a framework, and then maybe Singapore or Hong Kong will look to adopt. Right. I think here in Asia, things will just be like, hey, just figure it out yourself. Whatever works for your own interests, we'll implement that. And so it gives a lot of startups, in terms, especially in digital asset and blockchain, give us a lot of these companies the full flexibility in terms of what they envision the product should be, in terms of how they want to scale or onboard users adoption. Like basically, they can be very creative about it, right? Until we see US catch up with that, I think most of the hype and most of the onboarding, the user adoption will come from Asia.
Mm-hmm. So, in terms of the different regulatory approaches there, so are you saying that you think that the approach in Asia is better for the industry in terms of its long-term growth?
Well, it depends on where you're coming from. So, for example, if you're exchange, right, from an exchange perspective, you want to be in an environment where it's black and white. So you know
Mm-hmm.
exactly what not to do and what to do, right? And for example, Singapore is a great place for exchanges because Singapore is way ahead of the game in terms of, um, you know, uh, basically building the playbook for exchanges to how to, regulate digital asset
Mm-hmm.
investment for retailers. But if you're in the shoes of investors like venture funds like us, you can be quite flexible in terms of where you want to be. For example, we picked Taiwan because Taiwan
Mm-hmm.
has less regulation. It's more of a gray area. They're actually quite friendly towards blockchain technology, and they have been always been encouraging entrepreneurs to kind of like explore the use case of digital asset. It's not as black and white as Singapore or Hong Kong, and so it actually gives us a lot of flexibility in terms of what direction we want to invest or where we want to, for example, um, uh, where we want to operate. But more importantly, I think it gives startups, the full spectrum in terms of where they feel that it's comfortable in terms of where they're heading. For example, if you want to do exchange in Singapore, very, very tough, right? You need to have exchange, you
Mm-hmm.
give it a license, you need to have connections and all that stuff. Whereas there's actually a good amount of exchanges in Taiwan. They're just not big.
Mm-hmm.
So this is an example where two different countries, they both speak Mandarin, Chinese, but then you have like because of their very regulatory environment, the products are very different, or the result of these products are very different.
Mm-hmm. So I think like I'm just going to bring up this article as something just to look at. So this was like from 5 days ago when Hong Kong legalized crypto trading. Brian Armstrong from Coinbase was kind of quite vocal on the need for, as it says here, Congress to act fast on crypto regulation in risk of losing out. So is this something that really seems to fit in with your thesis then here?
So 100% in terms of like where Hong Kong is, like where China is heading. So I mean, if you look back towards like the different parts of like uh, China starting with ICOs in the early days, you could raise hundreds of millions in 2016, 17, and then to banning ICOs absolutely in 2000 end of 2018. And then slowly working towards blockchain adoption, more of an enterprise side. And then recently we had the announcement where China is slowly looking towards NFTs as kind of a potential use case, right? You'll realize that China is definitely, they're bullish on the technology and they're looking for some kind of entryway towards the technology. But like I said, it's one of those things that it's like it becomes very sensitive because China wants to control a big part of this technology, but they realize they can't just do it on day one, right? They can't just like tell different countries around them to use their consensus, use their protocol, use their blockchain. It takes time for them to build confidence around what you're trying to build. And so what's going to happen is, first, China's going to be obviously working very, very slowly compared to like the US and Singapore. But what you do see is that they're slowly opening up, which is a good sign for the general market because it does seem that eventually that day will come, maybe in 5 years, maybe in 8 years, who knows? But the point is they're moving forward, and moving forward is better than not moving at all, right? So that's one part. The second part is Hong Kong as a fintech hub has always been trying to catch up to Singapore, and obviously I think they're with the FTX backlash and a lot of Singaporeans. I think this is a good time for Hong Kong to actually bring up a strategy where that he's like, hey, not only Singapore is willing to do something like this, actually, Hong Kong is also willing to adopt some of the, blockchain friendly environments that we have. Just to remind people that, hey, this is other than Singapore, this Hong Kong is still a dominant place to choose. Obviously, in response, you're seeing a lot of exchanges go there. But the key is that, even in my opinion, this is only my opinion. I personally think at the end of the day, Hong Kong is still like parts of highly dominated by China, and so for that reason, the players going to be in Hong Kong are going to be very different from the players in Singapore.
Right.
And specifically the ones who will strive in Hong Kong are the ones who have Chinese backing from day one. So without giving names, I think companies that generally have done really well in China, they wanted, let's say, they have certain investments or certain exposure to blockchain technology. They can, Hong Kong would be an amazing place for them, right? Because they have the proper connections, they have the proper infrastructure to build something they want to do. Being Hong Kong makes a lot of sense. Now, for
Yeah,
a company that has purely like no exposure in China, like pre-COVID, and their entire strategy is on more international market, but they're based in Hong Kong. They're most likely going to still move out to other places like Singapore, or if they're based in Asia or elsewhere. I mean, we've seen this with FTX moving out of Hong Kong. I mean, they were initially based in Hong Kong, but they quickly moved out of Hong Kong, right? So that's an example.
I think, I mean, here's an example here in terms of like Huobi announced that they're going to operate in Hong Kong and their token jumped 24% over the last 24 hours. That's quite a big jump and definitely outperforming the market at the moment.
Yeah. So I think all the Chinese exchanges or Chinese origin exchanges like KuCoin, Huobi, OK, MXC, a bunch on the list. I would argue that a lot of them will end up having an office in Hong Kong, and it kind of makes sense because they fall into that category where they've been in China before COVID, and but after COVID things have opened up, but then obviously they have options, and I personally think it makes more sense for them to be in Hong Kong than in Singapore. But there are companies who are based in Hong Kong that have probably will look to move out as well because they don't have the advantage. And it obviously it wouldn't be like this year or next year, but we're talking about like maybe 5 years from now.
Mm, okay. So, with regards to what's going on in Asia with Hong Kong, and you say the let's talk a little bit about you mentioned briefly, but China looking into NFTs as a kind of maybe a softer on ramp. So, what exactly is going on, and do you see this as being bullish for crypto in China or bearish?
Yeah, so just so everyone knows, like NFT has been around in China for some time now, and the way that NFT works is, you could create an NFT, but you can't transact the NFT. So
Right.
so you just create it and it's on the blockchain, it's living on the blockchain, and that's it, right? And you can do it for arts, like people do it for arts, people do it for merchandise, people do it for like souvenirs, whatever, right? It's like in their opinion, it's like a PR play, right?
Hmm.
It's like it's something that sounds cool and people feel like it's cool, but like how many people actually know the true value of it? Not many.
Hmm.
But products have adopted NFTs or blockchain tech into their products so that they feel that it's much more legit.
Hmm.
So the question now is, okay, why isn't like we're seeing a lot more like transaction or volume and over in the NFT market, even though Chinese government is very bullish on NFT? And the answer is it goes back to fiat, because anything that potentially could move the RMB out offshore, that could be
Hmm.
extremely dangerous for Chinese government. Chinese government is doing whatever they could to figure out, what is the proper mechanism to launch these digital asset products out into the global market without having to have where users could basically abuse the system, and you're moving a large chunk of RMB to potentially swap for like USD or USDT and all that stuff, right? So if you look at like the holistic view of like digital asset or blockchain technology, like it always boils down to like RMB. Like, for example, Bitcoin miners. Like Bitcoin miners is a
Hmm.
perfect example. You buy Bitcoin miners, you print BTC, and then that goes to whatever foreign currency you want, right? So it's like a straight direct way of like going from RMB to like foreign currencies. So similar here with NFT, you could obviously do that right now. If let's say the Chinese government were to open this technology out, so they're
Hmm.
figuring out, okay, how can I do it without having to expose the RMB in the international market? And that's the biggest concern, right? If
Hmm.
they figure this out, obviously there's going to be a lot of centralized players involved, which I think that is fine from a user perspective as long as they figure it out. I think there's going to be a lot more adoption in NFT, and there's going to be a lot more adoptions in other parts in the blockchain category, not just NFTs.
Do you see the timing lining up though for the execution of that? Because I think it was in the first Slate Asia that we ran. I think it was really interesting how you talked about how the Chinese tech market usually focuses on optimization and execution rather than innovation. It looks at what's happening in the West in terms of innovation, and then it improves it, waits, and then executes on a larger scale when it's figured out the bugs. Is that where it's at? Has there been enough innovation in outside of China in NFTs for them to really take advantage of that now? Do you think?
I personally think it's still early,
Okay.
and I think right now, if you look at just like in general the macro principle in terms of where China is heading towards, it's more about control rather than economic growth,
Hmm.
right? So here you have a technology that could be very, very explosive and obviously disruptive. If, used properly, you could scale your economy at exponential growth. I mean, you've seen how powerful crypto has basically benefited just the USD currency, right? Everything is
Hmm.
denominated in USD today.
Hmm.
The use case of the dollar is this. I think even government, the U.S. government couldn't have imagined. Like basically the entire cryptocurrency today is highly all denominated in USD, right?
Yeah,
So
and that's like
imagine,
$1.1 trillion. as well.
Yeah,
It's not
e-
a
e-
little amount of money.
right. So imagine if the RMB comes in and be like, "Hey, we want a fraction of that market." And again, we're
Mhm,
still in the, I think a lot of people will agree that we're still in the very early stages of the general market, the general industry. I think there's still going to be a lot of upside. So imagine if that number like quadruple or like 10x or like even 50x, right, in a couple of years from now,
mhm,
then obviously there's going to be a lot of pressure from the Chinese government and be like, okay, we want to get a piece of that, and how can we get a piece of that? And so, I personally think that will align with when it becomes of interest. So maybe in the next 1 or 2 years, they'll still be focusing on figuring things out. But when Bitcoin becomes so big that for them, it's like it's less of, oh, like figuring it out. It's more like we want to get in now because like this is
mhm,
it. It's basically too big to ignore, right? Then I think that's when you start to see like a lot more adoption, perhaps even
mhm,
from a currency perspective. Maybe the launch the digital RMB. There's a lot of rumors saying that it's going to launch soon. It's going to launch soon, but it's been around for a couple of years now, and we still haven't seen the full the use case of it. But what
mhm,
China is really good at, which I think a lot of people agree, is that they're really good at hopping technology. So generally, like in the US, for example, your technology is based on like you'll go from like a level one to a level two, level three, level four. China just goes from like level one and then hops straight to level four.
mhm,
So these are things that we've seen that like a good example of that is the payment software in China, right?
mhm.
China basically skipped the entire like online banking system, which is still highly used to in the US today, and they went straight for Alipay and WeChat Pay, which is
Mhm.
way more advanced in the US today. I
Yeah,
mean,
it
if
really it
even
really blows my mind when people, because I forget this. In the UK, we have similar things now, like, if I wanna send money to a friend, I can do it in my banking app, and it's not an issue. I don't need things like Venmo or, um, Cash App and things. These are just not tools that exist in the UK at all. We don't need them.
yeah,
The US, they're stuck with them because of the way that their banking system works, and it's just incredible.
yeah, I think it's going to be a similar trend here when China adopts blockchain tech. It's going to be a very similar effect where they're just going to go straight and hop onto into implementing maybe a digital currency straight into like blockchain or the
Mhm.
ecosystem.
Yeah, and I mean, when you look at sort of market caps, just like looking at gold as an example, gold's just re-hit its all-time high, or just surpassed it, hit an all-time high, $12.9 trillion. Bitcoin's currently down at 450. It has passed the trillion before. So yeah, when you're talking about 10x in the market cap, I mean, in terms of other assets that people compare things like Bitcoin to, there's a lot of room potentially to grow without it being like astronomical. Like, if Bitcoin had the same market cap as gold, I don't think people, like a lot of people in the world, people in the space, would see that as a massive an anomaly. There's logic for that to happen over a long enough
Right.
time frame, like you say.
Yeah. I mean, gold is
Here's what
still
I found.
widely used around like the world, right? I mean, like even Chinese citizens, they could obtain gold, right, if they wanted to, but they can't do that for Bitcoin. Like majority of people in China does not hold Bitcoin, right? So
Hmm.
imagine if that market opens up or to digital asset,
Hmm.
right? So that's going to be very powerful. Not necessarily Bitcoin, but we're going to see some form of digital asset where I think it's going to be highly used, for Chinese.
Hmm. So, are there any catalysts that we can look out for, or what are you looking for around now that Hong Kong is open up to some assets? There's going to be some exchanges there. You're talking about China needing to feel comfortable that the RMB isn't going to be leaving the country en masse. What would be a catalyst that we're looking for to see? Oh, there's a potential that China may open up to a few currencies, maybe in a similar way to Hong Kong.
This is a great question, right? So I think if you look at um, the history in terms of how China have developed over time, you'll notice that if there is if the government is generally very like pro in terms of innovation and technology, generally that's when we've seen a lot of entrepreneurs coming out to push for new technologies or innovations around the areas that the government has been very bullish on.
Hmm.
So the funny thing about like the Chinese the economy in China, like entrepreneurs in China, is that they always follow what the government says. So if the government says we're very bullish on these categories, then entrepreneurs will, even if they don't know much about this technology,
Hmm.
like they have their education has nothing to do with technology, they'll try to get involved because they feel
Right.
like that's a trend. Um, Unlike in the US, a lot of times it's like, oh, I have a background in AI, and that's why I'm doing AI, right? In China, it's like I don't have a background in AI, but I'm still doing AI.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it all boils down to like the policy, the macro policies, and right now, I think at least for the next 4 or 5 years, I mean, we just had a transition in China. Um, I think it's still going to be mainly flat. I think it's still going to mainly be more about control. Maybe and after like a couple of years from now, we might see if there's going to be more much a transition in the macro play and from a Chinese government perspective, then we might see some explosive technology use case coming out. But I mean, if you look at the trend right now, we're still very, very early, right? It's like
Hmm.
after so many years, Hong Kong just announced they're going to do this. I mean,
Hmm.
if you think about it, right? It's like Hong Kong have been announcing certain things, licenses, all that stuff for a while now, but then like like this should have came out like years ago, but it
Hmm.
just took them that long to announce something like this. So I think there's still going to be some time where they go from like, okay, now we're going to implement this, and then we'll see who want to work with, and then we'll build a committee around it, and then we'll start executing a lot some of the things that we promised, right? And that's going to take at least 2 3 years, right? So we're probably not going to see that many like huge big movement going on. But companies moving into Hong Kong, or I mean, most of the companies I mentioned, like OKX, will be like they already have offices in Hong Kong, right?
Hmm.
So I get confused when they say that we're moving to Hong Kong. I'm like, I mean, you guys have offices in Hong Kong
Hmm.
already, right? So it's like, um, is it going to have a huge change in the near future? I personally think there's still going to some time, but I
Hmm.
think what we can expect is that when the government does decide to make a bigger change on the macro perspective, it's going to be that leap forwards. It's going to be that jump where you're going from not a lot of people doing blockchain to a lot of people doing blockchain.
Hmm.
And it's going to grow exponentially. And this is how we've seen in the previous tech trend as well.
Hmm. Fascinating, brilliant. Well, Jason, that was a great insight, and it's been too long since we've talked. So hopefully, we can get back on track with the trend, because I think it's a great area to be looking at. I think when you've got people like Cameron Winklevoss that are validating your thesis. I mean, you were saying what he was saying like 3 months ago. So if people watching the show want to get the alpha on what's going on in China and Asia in general, I think we've kind of showcased by what's happening at the moment that Jason, you really know your stuff and you've got your ear to the ground. So I'm excited to see what's coming in future. And yeah, I think for this episode of SlateAsia, then let's call it a wrap. Jason, do you want to sign us off and say goodbye?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, if there's any comments or topics that the audience want us to like discuss, I'm always happy to discuss. And I'm looking forward to the next podcast.
Cool. All right, guys, don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, all that stuff for the algorithm. And for me and Jason, we'll see you next time. Goodbye.